I knew I shouldn't, but the way my friend's mom looked at me. I couldn't say no. The first time I really noticed her, it wasn't at a party or some dramatic, movie-like moment. It was quiet, almost mundane, yet unforgettable. My friend had asked me to help him move a few boxes from his mom's garage. I wasn't expecting much, just a couple of hours of awkward lifting and small talk, but that day, something subtle shifted, though I didn't realize it at the time. I opened the garage door to find her standing near the workbench, sunlight falling across her face in a way that made everything about her seem deliberate and luminous. She was wearing a simple blouse and jeans, but she carried herself with a confidence that felt effortless. There was grace in the way she moved, the small way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other as she sorted through tools. Her hair caught the light, glinting in shades I hadn't noticed before, brown with faint, unexpected highlights that seemed to dance when she moved. When she looked up at me, her gaze held a spark of amusement, like she had already noticed my nervousness. I felt my chest tighten slightly, a flutter I hadn't experienced in a long time. Her smile wasn't just polite, it was knowing, a quiet acknowledgement of my presence that made me hyper-aware of myself. And then, just like that, she smirked, tiny, subtle, impossible to misinterpret. My hands were full of boxes, and as I fumbled with one particularly awkwardly sized crate, she stepped closer to help. Our hands brushed once, just the briefest contact, but the warmth of it lingered far longer than it should have. I was suddenly acutely aware of her proximity, the faint scent of her perfume, something soft and floral, almost comforting, almost intoxicating. The way her arm moved past mine, the gentle pressure of her hand as she steadied the box with me, left a spark I couldn't quite name. We worked side by side, carrying heavy boxes into the living room. Each movement felt charged, though we didn't acknowledge it. She offered a small laugh when I struggled with a particularly unwieldy box, and the sound was warm, rich, and strangely familiar, as if I'd known it my whole life. I caught myself staring a moment too long, noticing the way her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, how her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled, the easy rhythm of her breathing as she moved. There was a strange tension in the air, one I didn't understand at first. It wasn't loud or dramatic, there were no fireworks, no awkward near collisions, but something subtle hummed beneath the surface. I was drawn to her, inexplicably, and yet I was painfully aware of the social rules I wasn't supposed to break. My mind flickered between fascination and guilt, excitement and hesitation. She seemed to notice my attention, or maybe it was instinct, and she tilted her head, letting a strand of hair fall just so, her lips curving into that same knowing smirk. It was playful, teasing, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to speak, to make some clever remark, but my throat went dry, and I settled for a nervous smile. She laughed lightly, and it felt like the sound wrapped around me, making the room warmer, smaller, more intimate than it actually was. By the time we finished moving the last box, I realized I hadn't really noticed the time passing. She lingered by the doorway as I set the final crate down, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other. There was no rush, no need for words, just a shared acknowledgement of something unspoken. I could feel the tension in my chest, the way my pulse had sped, the faint warmth in my palms from where our hands had brushed earlier. As I left the garage, I glanced back, catching her looking at me with that same mixture of amusement and something deeper, something I couldn't name. It was a look that promised a story, a connection, and perhaps even danger, social, emotional, uncharted. And though I tried to dismiss it, I knew I wouldn't be able to. Not now, not ever. That day, the spark was small, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It lingered in my mind, in the quickening of my heartbeat, in the memory of a touch that should have meant nothing, but had meant everything. And it was only the beginning. After that first afternoon in the garage, I couldn't stop thinking about her. It wasn't just her looks, though she was breathtaking, but the way she seemed to notice things, the way she could make ordinary moments feel electric. Over the next few weeks, our paths crossed more often than I expected. Small errands, family gatherings, casual helping moments, each encounter carried an undercurrent of tension I couldn't shake. The first moment that really caught me off guard happened at a Saturday barbecue at my friend's house. She appeared wearing a soft, form-fitting sweater and jeans, a subtle elegance in her movements that contrasted with the casual atmosphere. She spotted me by the grill, and that same smirk danced across her lips, a knowing, mischievous curve that made me want to both run and freeze at the same time. She sauntered over, casually leaning on the counter where I was attempting to flip burgers without burning them. "You really need lessons," she said lightly, her tone teasing but not cruel. Her eyes sparkled, and I felt my chest tighten. I laughed nervously, trying to play it cool, but inside, every word felt like it was charged with something more than casual conversation. "You're too cute to be so clumsy," she added, and I choked on the spatula for a moment. Her smile was small, playful, but it lingered, and I realized she was studying me, testing my reaction, and enjoying the effect she had on me. I felt exposed and exhilarated at the same time. Every brush of her hand as she adjusted a plate or handed me a utensil sent little jolts of awareness up my arm. The air seemed warmer, somehow, or maybe it was just me. Later, she asked me to help her carry a tray of drinks to the backyard. The tray was heavier than I expected, and I stumbled slightly. She laughed softly, the sound wrapping around me like a familiar melody, and I realized she wasn't just amused by my clumsiness, she seemed genuinely entertained by my flustered reactions. My hand brushed hers once more, this time longer than necessary, and I felt that subtle warmth again, the kind that leaves a tingling imprint long after it's gone. As we set the tray down, she leaned in slightly to hand me a napkin, and our faces were closer than necessary. I caught a hint of her perfume again, something floral, comforting yet alluring. I could feel her breath, faint but present, and the way her eyes lingered on mine was impossible to ignore. There was a silent game unfolding, playful but with an edge I couldn't quite place. Over the next few encounters, the pattern repeated. She found reasons to ask for my help with small tasks, moving boxes, carrying groceries, even just holding a door open. Each interaction was innocent on the surface but layered with tiny gestures, a hand brushing mine, a lingering look, a soft laugh at a joke only we seemed to share. I became hyper-aware of the space between us, the subtle warmth of her presence, and the way my heart raced when she looked at me in that way. The tension wasn't uncomfortable, it was thrilling. I felt both drawn to her and frustrated by my own hesitation. Every time I imagined the consequences, my chest tightened, and yet I kept returning to her orbit, like a moth circling a quiet flame. She seemed to notice my internal struggle, often smirking just slightly, as if aware that she had awakened something in me I couldn't control. Even casual conversations felt charged. When she leaned against the counter, crossing her arms and talking about a mundane topic, recipes, a book she had read, or my friend's latest antics, her gestures, the tilt of her head, and the subtle shifts in her expression carried more weight than the words themselves. I found myself analyzing her every movement, every tone of voice, each smile and laugh, as if trying to decode a secret I wasn't sure I wanted to know. By the end of that week, I realized our encounters had changed me. I walked on a heightened awareness, anticipating the next time I'd see her, replaying moments where her hand brushed mine or her eyes lingered just a second too long. The playful teasing wasn't just flirtation, it was a delicate thread weaving between us, invisible yet undeniably present, pulling me closer without either of us saying a word. That's when I first began to understand the gravity of what was happening. I wasn't just drawn to her beauty or her confidence, I was captivated by her presence, by the way she made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. And though I tried to convince myself to stay detached, the tension, the electricity, the small, intimate touches had already begun to anchor themselves deep in my chest, quietly demanding my attention, and I knew this was only the beginning. It was in the quiet moments after our playful encounters that I began to realize how deeply she had settled into my mind. At first, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was curiosity, admiration, or just the thrill of noticing someone older, confident, and undeniably graceful. But the more I saw her, the more impossible it became to ignore the pull. I remember one particular afternoon when I was helping her organize boxes in the garage again. The room was small, lit by a single overhead bulb, and the dust motes floated lazily in the beams of light. She moved between boxes with ease, bending and lifting, and I found myself watching more than working. Every subtle motion, the way her back curved when she reached for something, the faint creak of her jeans as she shifted weight, the small sigh she gave when a box was heavier than expected, tugged at something inside me I didn't fully understand. It was in these private, unscripted moments that the internal conflict began. I noticed how my heart raced whenever her hand brushed mine, how my pulse spiked when her gaze lingered for a second too long. The tension between us had grown invisible threads that pulled taut with every interaction, and I found myself acutely aware of their weight. She was a study in grace and confidence, yet there was a quiet vulnerability in her expressions, moments when her smile faltered slightly or her eyes softened in a way that invited trust. She caught me staring once, or at least I thought she did. Her head tilted slightly, hair falling across one shoulder, and that same smirk curled her lips. It wasn't teasing this time, it was knowing, almost intimate, and it left me breathless. My mind scrambled, trying to rationalize it. She was my friend's mom, someone I wasn't supposed to notice in this way. And yet, everything in me wanted to lean into it, to linger in that gaze, to let the world narrow down to the two of us in that dimly lit garage. After that afternoon, the awareness only deepened. I began reflecting privately, replaying our encounters like a film running on slow motion. Her laughter, soft and melodic, echoed in my mind. The warmth of her hand, even when brief, lingered in my memory as though it had left an imprint on my skin. Her subtle touches, guiding me to hold a box correctly, brushing a speck of dust from my shoulder, felt monumental in their simplicity. Every tiny gesture carried weight, a language of unspoken intimacy that my heart understood before my mind could process it. At the same time, hesitation gnawed at me. Part of me knew the social boundaries I shouldn't cross. She was my friend's mother, respected, admired, off limits. Another part of me, however, was disarmingly honest in admitting that the tension we shared was intoxicating. Every glance, every smile, every fleeting touch whispered something that was impossible to articulate without breaking some invisible rule. And I began to realize, desire doesn't care for rules. It exists quietly, insistently, and sometimes painfully. It wasn't just desire, though. It was fascination. I wanted to understand her, the subtle shifts in her moods, the quiet stories behind her smiles, the life experience she carried with such effortless grace. And there was a part of me that wanted her to notice me in the same way, to see beyond the surface, to acknowledge the pull I felt without words. One evening, as I left after helping with yet another task, she paused at the doorway, just long enough for our eyes to meet. There was a softness in her gaze that unsettled me, a combination of curiosity and something warmer that I couldn't define. My chest tightened, my thoughts scattered, and I caught myself hoping, almost desperately, that our hands would brush, that she'd linger a moment longer, that something would break the tension without either of us needing to speak. Walking home, I couldn't shake the image of her from my mind. I replayed the moments we shared, her playful smirk, the gentle warmth of her hand, the quiet strength in her movements, and the faint, almost imperceptible vulnerability beneath it all. I realized then that the attraction was no longer a passing curiosity, it had grown into a quiet obsession, layered with guilt, admiration, and a yearning that terrified me as much as it exhilarated me. And so the awareness settled in, heavy and insistent. I wasn't just noticing her anymore, I was feeling her. Every interaction, no matter how brief or innocent, left an imprint on my body and mind. The tension between what was appropriate and what I wanted swirled inside me, raw and unrelenting. And in that swirl of emotion, I realized one thing with painful clarity. I was already caught, whether I liked it or not. The days after my growing awareness of her presence were restless. Every thought of her left a lingering warmth in my chest, an ache that was part longing, part confusion. And then it happened, one of those moments that felt suspended outside of ordinary time, where the world narrowed until it consisted solely of the two of us. It was a rainy Saturday. My friend had gone off to a sports match, leaving me behind to help his mom with a project she'd been putting off for weeks, organizing her home office. I arrived to find her already at work, sorting stacks of papers and gently dusting the shelves. The rain tapped softly against the windows, creating a private soundtrack for the afternoon, cocooning us in an almost cinematic intimacy. "Thanks for helping again," she said, her voice warm and familiar, yet somehow carrying a subtle edge that made me aware of the space between us. She smiled at me, leaning slightly over the desk as she examined a pile of papers. The small movement drew my eyes, naturally, to the curve of her shoulders, the way her hair fell across her face, and the delicate arch of her hands as they sifted through the documents. I tried to focus on the work, but the air between us was charged. Every glance, every gesture carried more weight than it should. We worked quietly, the sound of the rain outside punctuating our silence. Occasionally, she would pass me a stack of folders, and our hands would brush. Each accidental contact sent a flutter through me, electric, unspoken, lingering longer than necessary. There was no rush, no need for words. The pauses, the shared glances, the simple act of being in the same room created a tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. At one point, she stepped closer to reach a high shelf, and I instinctively moved to steady her. Our bodies aligned for a brief moment, chest to chest, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a fraction of a second, the playful smirk from before softened into something more vulnerable, almost intimate. My pulse raced, my stomach tightened, and I realized that every subtle touch had become magnified in its meaning. She laughed softly at something I muttered under my breath, a sound that felt like it wrapped around me, drawing me in. She leaned against the edge of the desk, close enough that our knees touched lightly as we crouched to organize a box of supplies. It was such a small contact, a fleeting brush, yet it left an imprint on my senses that I couldn't shake. The warmth of her hand on the desk, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the mustiness of the office, the softness in her eyes, it was all intensely, painfully vivid. We paused for a moment, each of us catching our breath from bending and lifting. She straightened, and I caught a fleeting expression of thoughtfulness on her face. It was the kind of look that made me want to reach out and trace the lines of her cheek with my fingertips, yet I restrained myself. The restraint itself was part of the tension, the delicious, excruciating space between what we felt and what we dared to act upon. As the afternoon wore on, our conversation deepened. She asked about my life, my dreams, my struggles, and I found myself sharing things I had never told anyone my own age. She listened genuinely, leaning in slightly as I spoke, her hand resting momentarily on my forearm for reassurance. There was a weight in that touch, an unspoken understanding that we were both acknowledging without words. I realized then that our intimacy was not merely physical, it was emotional, rooted in genuine care, curiosity, and a strange, forbidden closeness that made my chest ache. When the project was done, I lingered, reluctant to break the bubble of quiet closeness we had created. She smiled at me, a soft, genuine expression, and I felt the pull of unspoken words between us. For a fleeting second, our hands touched again as she handed me a pen I had dropped, lingering in that contact longer than strictly necessary. The world outside the office, the rain, my friend's absence, all of it faded into a blur. It was just her, just me, and the electric tension that connected us like an invisible thread. By the time I left, I was acutely aware of everything that had happened. Every brush of skin, every lingering glance, every quiet conversation had etched itself into my memory. The close moments weren't loud or dramatic, but they carried a weight that felt far greater than their simplicity suggested. I walked away with my heart pounding, aware that our connection had deepened in ways that could not be undone. And I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me, that this was only the beginning of something far more profound. It happened on a quiet evening, one of those moments that feels ordinary until it's anything but. I had stopped by my friend's house to drop off a book he'd lent me. His mom was there, sitting on the living room couch with a cup of tea, the golden lamplight casting soft shadows across her face. She looked effortlessly graceful, even in the casual setting, and I realized again how magnetic her presence was. Every time I saw her, every fleeting glance or accidental brush of hands, felt like it rewrote the rules of what I thought I knew about desire. We began talking, initially about nothing, books, movies, small anecdotes from our week. But the conversation had a rhythm of its own, a delicate dance between casual exchange and subtle tension. Her eyes would flicker toward me at unexpected moments, soft but intense, and I felt the same pull I'd experienced countless times before. I tried to focus on my words, on the topic at hand, but it was impossible. I was acutely aware of her proximity, the way the lamp's light caught in her hair, the faint warmth radiating from her when she shifted slightly on the couch. Then it happened, the moment that changed everything, the moment she leaned in slightly, just enough that our shoulders brushed, and delivered it, "You're too cute to say no to." The words were light, teasing, yet they carried a weight I hadn't expected. I froze, caught somewhere between exhilaration and guilt. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Her eyes held mine, warm and playful, but there was also something more beneath the surface, a recognition, a challenge, a subtle acknowledgement of the tension that had been simmering between us for weeks. I tried to respond casually, to laugh it off, but the truth was undeniable. The smirk on her lips, the sparkle in her eyes, and the faint, deliberate brush of her hand against mine as she handed me the teacup, it all made it impossible to ignore what was happening. I was acutely aware of the rise and fall of her chest, the soft cadence of her laughter, the warmth of her fingers lingering briefly on my palm. Every small detail pressed itself into my awareness, leaving my heart racing. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was charged, electric in its subtlety. I could feel her studying me, gauging my reaction, and I realized she was enjoying this just as much as I was, this delicate interplay of words, glances, and proximity. It was a revelation in itself. We were both conscious of the tension, both aware of the unspoken connection, and yet neither of us had crossed the line. Not yet. Her voice softened then, just a fraction, as if she were letting a small piece of herself through. "I've noticed you," she said, almost whispering. "More than I probably should." My throat went dry, my chest felt tight, and a strange warmth pooled in my stomach. Her honesty wasn't overwhelming, it was quiet, intimate, and it left space for me to respond in kind, even if I wasn't ready to. I swallowed hard, trying to collect my scattered thoughts. My mind raced, caught between the exhilaration of desire and the reality of our situation. She was my friend's mom, someone I had always been taught to respect, admire from afar. And yet, here she was, acknowledging a mutual pull that neither of us could deny. Every nerve in my body seemed to hum with awareness, every glance, every subtle movement between us laden with meaning. We talked longer that evening, the conversation flowing naturally yet charged with an intensity one couldn't ignore. Each laugh, each gentle touch, every shared look felt monumental. When I finally left, the moment lingered, heavy in my chest, replaying endlessly in my mind. The smirk, the words, the warmth, they had broken the dam of subtle attraction, revealing the depth of what had been quietly building for weeks. By the time I walked home, I understood something with stark clarity. Our dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The playful encounters, the accidental touches, the lingering glances, all of it had led to this acknowledgement. And though the consequences of what we felt were uncertain, the exhilaration of having it named, even lightly, was intoxicating. I was no longer simply aware of her, I was caught, undeniably, and entirely, by her presence. That night, I lay awake replaying her words, her smirk, the soft brush of her fingers, and I realized that this was the turning point. Everything before had been a prelude, a slow build. Now, the tension had become undeniable, and the question was no longer whether we felt something, it was what we would do with it. After that evening, everything changed, but nothing changed. The acknowledgement of attraction hung between us like a delicate thread, invisible to the outside world but taut with tension in every encounter. I found myself replaying her smirk, her teasing words, the way her hand had brushed mine, and each memory was electric, leaving me restless and distracted. But the awareness of what we were risking kept me cautious, hesitant, and painfully aware of boundaries I didn't want to cross yet couldn't ignore. Walking into her house became a study in careful observation. Every movement, every glance, every subtle shift in posture became loaded with significance. I noticed the way she leaned slightly when speaking to me, how her eyes lingered longer than necessary, the faint way her perfume would fill the space as I approached. Each small gesture pulled me closer emotionally, yet my mind screamed caution, reminding me of her age, her position, the impossible social norms that hovered over us like an invisible wall. Even ordinary interactions became fraught with meaning. When she handed me a dish or guided me to adjust a box, the accidental touch of our hands sent jolts through me. When she smiled softly, or laughed at something trivial I said, I felt a warmth that was equal parts comforting and destabilizing. The tension was quiet but relentless, a subtle hum running through every shared moment. I found myself anticipating these encounters, yet dreading them too, knowing that each glance, each brush of skin, was both irresistible and forbidden. At the same time, I became painfully aware of my own hesitation. I wanted to reach for her, to let my hand linger just a moment longer, to meet her gaze with a boldness I didn't have. But the rational part of me, the part trained by years of knowing social boundaries, stopped me. The internal dialogue was exhausting. She's my friend's mom. She's older. You shouldn't feel this way. But why does it feel so right? Each thought collided with the next, creating a storm of desire, guilt, and longing that I couldn't reconcile. She, too, seemed caught in her own hesitations. In those rare quiet moments, I caught fleeting glimpses of vulnerability behind her confident exterior. The playful smirk sometimes softened into a contemplative expression, as if she were weighing her own impulses against the reality of our situation. It made her human, approachable, achingly relatable. And yet, it also intensified the tension, because I knew she was just as aware of the attraction, just as conscious of the risk, as I was. The inner conflict became particularly acute during one late afternoon when I helped her with some paperwork at her dining table. The sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the room and illuminating her features in a way that made her glow. Our knees brushed lightly under the table, a subtle contact that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. My chest tightened with anticipation, every muscle in me wanted to reach across, to close the space, to acknowledge the pull between us physically. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the papers, pretending the heat in my palms and the flutter in my stomach weren't real. And yet, the tension was impossible to ignore. Our eyes met frequently, each glance a silent conversation layered with unspoken words. I notice you. I feel this too. But what do we do about it? Every pause, every hesitation, every slight shift of position carried meaning, and I became painfully aware of how much I hung on these tiny, delicate moments. The danger of exposure only made the allure more potent, the longing more acute, the internal struggle sharper. Even after leaving, my thoughts remained entangled with her. I replayed every smile, every lingering touch, every moment of quiet intimacy, and felt both exhilarated and tormented. I realized then that desire was no longer something I could ignore, it had become a constant presence, pressing against my chest, whispering in my mind, demanding acknowledgement. And yet, the hesitation, the awareness of boundaries, the fear of crossing a line, made every choice more agonizing. By the end of the week, I understood something essential. The tension between us had reached a peak. It was no longer playful curiosity or subtle fascination. It was emotional, electric, and impossibly delicate, a dance on the edge of what we could allow ourselves to feel. And within that tension lay a truth I could not escape. I wanted her, not recklessly, not carelessly, but deeply, emotionally, irrevocably. And in the quiet corners of my mind, I knew she wanted the same. The tension that had been simmering between us for weeks reached a subtle, quiet crescendo on a late spring evening. I had gone over to her house under the pretense of returning a book, but the truth was, I was seeking her presence, the pull that had grown irresistible, the warmth that lingered long after every encounter. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the room, and everything about the scene felt suspended, as if the world had slowed just for us. She was sitting at the kitchen table, casually flipping through a magazine, her posture relaxed but elegant. When she looked up and saw me, that familiar smirk appeared on her lips, the one that had haunted my thoughts for weeks. It wasn't teasing this time, it was softer, warmer, almost hesitant. The kind of smirk that held questions, confessions, and the unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had been building between us. I set the book down on the table, our fingers brushing lightly as I handed it to her. That fleeting contact, so ordinary in any other context, felt monumental. I could feel the warmth of her hand against mine, the subtle pressure, the way her fingers lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was charged, electric in its subtlety. Neither of us needed to speak to acknowledge what was happening between us. She finally broke the quiet, her voice soft, intimate. "I've been thinking about us," she said, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. There was no rush, no pressure, just honesty, quiet and deliberate. "I know this is complicated. I know the rules. But I can't ignore it anymore." I swallowed, my throat dry, every nerve alive with anticipation. The words I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my mind felt unnecessary now. The honesty in her voice, the way she looked at me, the warmth that radiated from her presence, it all spoke louder than anything I could say. I found myself leaning in, drawn by a gravity I hadn't wanted to name but could no longer resist. For a moment, we simply sat there, suspended in that shared understanding. I reached out, hesitated, and then let my hand rest lightly on hers. The contact was gentle, respectful, yet it carried the weight of all the moments we had shared, the accidental brushes, the lingering glances, the quiet conversations that had built this invisible bridge between us. She squeezed my hand once, softly, as if acknowledging the same longing I felt but tempered with care and caution. Our conversation flowed naturally after that, slower, more deliberate. We spoke about boundaries, about the risks, about what we wanted without rushing into anything reckless. Every word, every glance, every touch was layered with meaning. The playful tension that had defined our interactions transformed into something deeper, more secure, a connection built on honesty, trust, and mutual respect. By the time the evening drew to a close, we had reached a delicate resolution. The attraction that had been simmering for so long was acknowledged, held gently between us, but framed by a shared understanding of its complexity. There was no rash decision, no dramatic confession that shattered the world around us, only the quiet, steady recognition of something real, something that could grow without fear or shame. As I stood to leave, she walked me to the door. Our hands brushed once more, lingering slightly, and she smiled, warm, reassuring, intimate. "See you soon," she said softly, and I knew that the bond we had forged would continue, carefully, thoughtfully, in a way that honored both our feelings and the world around us. Walking home, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and calm. The tension that had kept me restless for weeks was replaced by a gentle warmth, a sense of security in knowing that what we had was acknowledged, mutual, and respected. The pull between us hadn't disappeared, it had simply found its proper place, a quiet, steady force that promised connection, intimacy, and care without chaos or recklessness. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind. The smirk, the brush of her hand, the soft warmth of her presence, the quiet honesty in her words. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive, but it was real, and it was ours. And in that quiet, gentle way, I realized that this resolution, this emotional closure, was far more powerful than anything I could have imagined. The story didn't end with fireworks or public declarations. It ended with understanding, with trust, with the quiet acknowledgement of a connection that had changed me forever. We had crossed the line of subtle attraction into something meaningful, respectful, and deeply personal, and that, I realized, was the truest form of romance there could be.